Welcome to Time of Death. This video is for informational purposes and in no way meant to glorify or condone violence. In today's video, we'll be discussing the murder of Fernando Zamorano. Zamorano was shot and killed on Saturday, August 13, 2016, in the 600 block of East Olympic Boulevard in East LA, according to LA County Coroner records. David Lunar and Joe Garcia were subsequently arrested and charged with the murder. The following is the evidence at trial. Midori Mendoza testified she had been friends with the victim for about a year at the time of his murder on August 13, 2016. They were members of VNE. He was in the TikTok set of Montebello and she was in the Primo set in Lancaster. Mendoza was at the victim's house that night. At around 11 p.m., the victim, Mendoza, and her friend Victoria left the house to go to the liquor store. The woman walked and the victim rode a bike. Mendoza had seen him get dressed and knew the victim was not armed. The liquor store was closed, so they went to a nearby bar called Lito's Courtroom. The TikTok's VNE set was strong in the area around the bar, and local enemy gangs included the Stoners and the King Cobras. Mendoza was broke, so instead of going into the bar, she stood outside between two bus benches to smoke a cigarette and make phone calls. After about 5 minutes, the victim came out of the bar and asked her what she wanted to drink and invited her inside. She said no and suggested they go back to his house. Just then, Mendoza saw two males walking up behind the victim from an alley and told him to be careful. When the men were close enough, about 2 car lengths away, the victim asked them, "What's up, where y'all from?" The men mumbled something, one of them nodded to the other or shook his head, and one said, "Alright, homie," which was like saying it's cool. As they passed by, the victim said, "Alright, well this is VNE, Minor." Minor was the victim's gang name. The victim walked his bike to stash it. As he turned back toward the bar, Mendoza saw that the two men had not gone into the bar but were standing around. One man stood by the door leaning against it so nobody could come out. A surveillance video showed him putting down a beverage can and picking it back up. The other man headed back toward Mendoza and the victim, pulling a revolver out of his waistband. She told the victim to be careful because the man was packing, but it was too late. She heard 5 rapid shots and saw the shooter running toward the victim who had his back to her. The victim turned around, ran toward her, and fell against her. The two men ran back toward the alley they had come from. When Victoria ran out of the bar and reached the victim, Mendoza ran after the men, who got into a white SUV and sped away. Mendoza ran back to the victim and waited for help, but he took his last breath before the ambulance arrived. Defendant was the shooter. Mendoza identified Garcia as defendant's companion, both at trial and at the preliminary hearing. That night, the victim wore a Yankees hat with part of the Y crossed out to stand for VNE. The jury saw a surveillance video showing the events around the shooting outside the bar. Mendoza identified defendant and Garcia on the video. A detective testified that when deputies viewed surveillance video of the shooting, one deputy easily identified defendant's companion as Garcia, whom he had contacted when he was in the gang unit. Garcia was in his 40s, was a member of Stoners 13, and on the white Toyota Sequoia SUV. A forensic identification specialist recovered 7 cartridge casings and 3 possible bullet fragments from the scene. The cartridge casings carried head stamps saying 9mm Luger, WIN. A deputy medical examiner testified the victim's body had 5 gunshot entry wounds. The fatal shot entered the back of his left shoulder and passed through the aorta, causing the victim's death in 5 to 10 minutes. Another shot entered the front of his left pelvis, showing the victim had turned around or was in the process of turning to face the shooter. A third shot entered the front of his left thigh, a fourth entered the front of his left ankle, and the fifth went through his left wrist, entering the palm side. Eduardo Rodriguez testified through a Spanish interpreter that 2 days after the victim's murder, on the night of August 15, 2016, he was sitting in the driver's seat of his parked car, smoking a cigarette and charging his phone. Rodriguez looked up, and in the light of the street lamps, he saw the defendant running a bicycle toward the front of the car. From right outside the driver's door, the defendant asked Rodriguez through the half-open window, "Where you from?" Rodriguez spoke little English, and in Mexico he had learned that meant, "Which country are you from?" He asked defendant if he spoke Spanish. Defendant repeated, "Where you from?" A moment later, Rodriguez heard a flurry of shots. He ducked his head down on the passenger seat and started to yell, hoping defendant would think one of the shots had hit him. Rodriguez looked up and saw defendant riding away on his bicycle. He opened the passenger side door and took off running, leaving his phone behind. Rodriguez returned about 2 minutes later to get his phone and call the police. His car had 4 bullet holes in the driver's side door. Rodriguez's car was facing east on Repetto Avenue toward Belden. Rodriguez used to live in the area, but after the shooting, he was so scared that he moved away. On September 30th, 2016, Rodriguez selected from a 6-pack photo array 2 photos resembling the shooter, including one of the defendant. He told the detective defendant's photo looked most like the shooter, but the shooter wore a baseball cap and his eyes looked bigger. The deputy who responded to the shooting testified Rodriguez was distressed and frightened. He kept looking around. The deputy recovered 4 bullet casings. A deputy assigned as a firearms examiner testified the cartridge cases found at the scene of the victim's murder and those found near Rodriguez's car had been fired by the same 9mm pistol. After the deputies recovered Garcia's cell phone from his home, but before they could review its contents, the phone had been remotely wiped and returned to factory settings. A search of Garcia's home found gang clothing and photographs of Garcia making Stoner's 13 gang signs. On September 15, 2016, a deputy found defendant riding his bike away from a fresh red spray painted graffiti, not far from Lito's courtroom. When the deputy told him to stop, defendant stopped, pulled a can of red spray paint out of his pocket, and threw it over a fence. The graffiti showed disrespect to rival gangs including VNE and East LA 13, and laid claim to the area for the Stoners, contesting the gang boundaries. Defendant told the deputy he had recently joined the Stoners with the moniker G-Money or Gunner, and before that he had been a member of Wicked Insane Diablos, going by Criminal. He wore a Seattle Mariners hat typically worn by Stoners. Stoners was tattooed across the back of his neck, and S13 was tattooed on his right arm. In his backpack was a blue LA Dodger pullover jacket, like the one the shooter wore in the surveillance video showing the events outside of Lito's courtroom the night of the victim's murder. During trial, the court declared a mistrial as to Garcia and proceeded against defendant only. Following the trial, the jury convicted defendant David Lunar of first-degree murder, attempted premeditated murder, shooting at an occupied vehicle, and 2 counts of being a felon in possession of a firearm. The jury also found true of the gun and gang enhancements. The court sentenced defendant to 89 years to life in state prison, plus a term of 45 years. Fernando Zamorano was 33 years old at the time of death.